Hello again, everybody. Welcome to week 8. I have a lot to cover in this lecture. I also have a demo that I'm going to include in your lecture this week. So let me get right into this. All right, so I assigned you basically 3 readings this week. The Clemens and Macbeth chapter is the basis of the demo that I'm going to give you, an Excel demo. It also happens to form the basis of the cost benefit exercise that I'm going to assign you this week. So please do read that. Craft chapter 6, actually the remainder of chapter 6, is also very helpful as we continue to discuss evaluating policy. And then I give you actually 2 sets of supplemental readings. One is a supplemental viewing, and that's from this organization called Conservation Strategy Funds. And if you go on Canvas, you see I link one of their videos, which happens to be the intro video, but I also link their YouTube channel, Conservation Strategy Funds. If you look at all those videos, it's probably going to take you about an hour and a half to 2 hours to complete the viewing. You probably don't have to look at all of them, but I will tell you, they're very helpful videos, and they're done in a really great way, and they really give you a feel for how cost-benefit analysis operates in the realm of policy, and especially social policy. So I really highly recommend those. But even if you don't watch all the conservation strategy funds, you might want to look at a few of them, because that way they'll be in your mind and you can use them for future reference, because they are helpful for if you're going to use cost benefit analysis in the future, for example, with your capstone. I think they're a really great source. And then the last supplemental reading is a couple of articles that I throw in on the use of discount rates and that effect of discount rates on public sector pensions. That's actually something that's pretty important too, because as probably some of you know, we do have a bit of a public sector pension crisis in the country, according to many scholars. And these 2 articles talk about one of the issues involved in that, and that is how discount rates and public sector pensions fit together. Okay, so why am I doing this? Why are we talking about this week? This idea of tools, in policy analysis. And just a couple points I want to make. One is, methodologies don't exist for their own sake. I mean, you might get that idea actually if you hang around academia a lot, that methodologies exist for their own sake. And I would admit that I think a lot of people, if they look at the academic journals, they can get that impression. But really, methodologies are used to answer questions, right? And the way you ask the question, or what the question is, really should lead to your methodology, not the reverse. I mean, you shouldn't say, I really want to use this methodology, so how should I ask this question? That's the opposite approach of what you should have. So in the case of policy analysis, we do use various methodologies to evaluate whether or not we really want to enact this policy, or we want to change this policy, or maybe just do away with this policy. We want to have methodologies as our tools. And that is because methodologies help bring consistency in our judgments, in our evaluations. We don't want to start with the policy solution and then move on to methodology, although, again, I think our observation would be that often many people start with a policy solution and then move on to the analysis. And we see that happening a lot. So let's go back to this table from Kraft on the criteria for evaluating policy. So again, we have these 8 or 9 different criteria sets, I would say, and they guide us to how we want to evaluate a policy. And again, different kinds of policy lend themselves to different kinds of evaluative criteria, right? And that's over there in that right-hand column of this table, where you might want to use these different kinds of evaluative criteria. And so it's important that you understand the kind of policy you're dealing with. And it's also important that your evaluation isn't inconsistent. So, I mean, for this class, for example, I'm asking you to develop for your paper, for your policy brief, kind of one set of criteria that you're going to use to evaluate various alternatives, right? So if you have a policy and you have 3 or 4 alternatives, I'm asking you to use one sort of policy criterion for evaluating those against each other. What you don't want to do, really, when you're talking about policy and evaluating policy is you don't want to evaluate one option, for example, on its political feasibility, and another option applying to the same policy on its efficiency. You don't want to mix and match your criteria across the same evaluation, because you actually end up biasing your result. So that's why this is important. So Kraft, the last part of chapter 6, talks about some more approaches to policy evaluation. So cost-benefit analysis is the one I'm going to spend some time on today, and the one I spent some time on in the demo. But really, what is cost-benefit analysis? It's really just a method of specifying or monetizing, and that's important, monetizing cost and benefits of a policy to aid in decision making. So again, cost-benefit analysis is not an end to itself. It's a tool. It's a way of monetizing costs and benefits. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that the exercise, the exercise of actually monetizing those costs and those benefits is not always objective. So people are hypnotized, or beguiled perhaps by cost-benefit analysis because it appears to be objective. And in fact, the methodology itself is objective. You're using numbers, but in setting those definitions, in saying, here is the various benefit categories, and we monetize them as such, and here are the various cost categories, and we monetize them as such. You could be very subjective in that, or you could be using flawed data. So a public policy example where cost-benefit analysis is often used is when cities or towns want to build a sports arena or a convention center or some combination of that. And what a lot of the research shows is that the benefits are often overstated. So, the people, the advocates who want to build the sports arena might overstate the amount of use that this arena is going to get. So that's a good example. But you express the results of a cost-benefit analysis either as a net benefit, which is just simply the dollar amount of benefits minus the dollar amount of costs, so that could be a negative number, or as a ratio, that is the benefits divided by the costs. So in that case, you're striving to come to a benefit to cost ratio closer to 1, or even above 1. That is 100%. But there are other approaches. So one is a cost-effectiveness analysis. So there's a difference between cost-effectiveness analysis and a cost-benefit analysis. And that's important to keep in mind, because when you hear those terms, when you hear people talk about cost-effectiveness or cost-benefit, they're really talking about two different tools. They're not the same tool. So a cost-effectiveness analysis actually really starts out with the assumption that you are going to incur costs. And so you're looking for the most efficient and the most effective way to implement the policy, given that you are going to spend money. But it really relieves us of monetizing benefits. So a public policy example would probably be something like city versus contractor trash collection. Or this week, I'm thinking of this as I'm staring out my front window, looking at a huge snow pile in my front yard. Um, the idea that the city um, contracts private snow removal companies to help with the process of snow removal. So there is going to be a cost to snow removal. The city actually takes on itself the responsibility for moving snow from the city streets, right? That's part of the responsibility that taxpayers fund and expect the city to engage in. But when we have a large snowstorm like the one we just had, um, the city is going to engage contractors to help remove snow. And so what's the cost effectiveness of that decision? And so what we want to look at it with cost effectiveness is, can we do something more efficiently given cost or more effective? And so again, efficiency and effectiveness don't always necessarily align. And so in the case of snow removal, effectiveness might be defined as getting all the snow off the streets from this 10-inch snowstorm, within 24 or 36 or 48 hours, so that people and school buses and pedestrians can use the roadways. Or it might be efficiency, just every dollar that we put into snow removal, what's the output from that dollar? Then there's risk assessment. Actually, I had some email exchanges with one of you on using a risk assessment kind of idea for your project. But that's actually just identifying, estimating, and evaluating magnitude of risks. So given that there will always be risks associated with every decision, right? So, I mean, you see this in airline travel, right? Flying on an airplane has risks associated, just like driving in a car has risks associated with it. So we have applied risk assessment in, our government-run air traffic control system, for example, or the inspection frequency and criteria for jet airliners. So other public policy examples, and I'm not trying to be overtly partisan or political here, but I just want to throw them out there because these two involve kind of a risk assessment. The wall that we always talk about, does our southern border need a wall? Or the subject of required immunizations. So without actually talking about whatever my view happens to be, if we say our southern border needs a wall, well, really what we ought to ask in the first place before coming to that policy solution is, okay, what's the problem on the southern border? And so you start talking about ideas like political ideas like sovereignty. So a demonstration of national sovereignty is the ability to control borders. So how do we control borders? There are many ways of controlling borders, right? Depending on the nation we're talking about, we could actually come to an agreement with open borders. So the European Union, one of the features of the European Union is open borders. And so right now in the European Union, with the idea that the UK voted to leave the European Union, one of the issues that is happening right now is what to do about the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Because Ireland will remain in the European Union, but Northern Ireland, as a part of the UK, will not. So it does, do they have to reestablish border control along that border? So, so the question on the wall on our southern border is, okay, so what's the question? How do we control immigration? How do we control just regular business transit across the border? How do we control tourist transit across the border? So the idea is, before coming to a solution, you actually have to ask the question and talk about risk. Same thing with the idea of required immunizations, right? So what is the risk of allowing parents not to have their children immunized, for example, for the disease of measles? And you can apply this risk assessment across all kinds of policy areas. And you could probably think of a lot more. I mean, things like flood control measures on rivers, levees, dams. So with this idea of risk assessment actually is very important for some policy areas. And then there's forecasting. So projecting the cost of policy, that's exactly what the Congressional Budget Office does. It does a 10-year projection for major policies. And so when you see headlines like the 2017 tax bill will raise the deficit by 1.5 trillion or something like that, what that really comes from is the CBO projection of policy. So CBO typically um, typically presents its forecasting in terms of a dollar amount, but that dollar amount is typically over a decade. It's usually not over 1 year. It's usually over a 10-year period. And then we have impact assessments. So related to forecasting, the impact of certain activities. So a public policy example of that is the environmental impact of allowing mining, or you could apply it to logging, um, in certain publicly owned lands. You could also apply that to grazing cattle. So, but we have an actual official thing called an environmental impact statement that's required under environmental law that does just that. It looks for the impact to the land. It looks for the impact to species of plants and animals. It looks for the impact to adjoining commercial activities and to farms, for example. And so that's another way of policy evaluation. And then just three more that Kraft mentions: political feasibility, implementation analysis, and ethical analysis. And now in these, you can see that these kinds of criteria become perhaps a little more subjective, right? So political feasibility really is just, the extent to which elected leaders support a policy. So right now in the Nebraska legislature, between the legislature and the governor, and actually within the legislature itself, we have the debate over property tax relief or property tax rates. But property taxes are just really just one form of tax revenue that a state raises. The other two big ones are sales tax and income tax. And actually, a couple weeks ago, when I was in our little effort on looking at census data, one of the things I wanted, the idea I wanted to get across is, states raise taxes in those three major areas, right? Property tax, um, sales tax, income tax, and there's other fees and taxes, but um, but any attempt, in my opinion, to just address one without addressing the other might actually suboptimize, right? So what we learned from that exercise is that the property tax in Nebraska is really the predominant source of revenue for our public school districts in Nebraska. And so what happens if, for example, property tax is capped? What's the impact on public school systems? And that is where it seems to me, that in the debate, we have to start talking about the offsets with the other forms of taxation. And so then there's implementation analysis, right? So that's either forecasting or studying in retrospect how difficult or easy it is or was to implement a policy. So we talk about when the Affordable Care Act rolled out, the website that was set up to actually allow people to sign up for insurance crashed right away, and that became a big issue. But how could we have done that better? Another policy that has been really studied is called Real ID, which was a law passed during the George W. Bush administration that had to do with making driver's licenses standardized between states. But that had some costs associated with it for the states, and that's what the debate centered around. And then finally, there's ethical analysis, which again, here you can see that we're really becoming a lot more subjective and talking about individual codes of ethics that people might have, or views of morality that people apply to their own lives and then attempt to apply to policy, and it becomes tricky, right? So page 213 has a really interesting example of that. So here, for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to really quickly look at highlight some of the things that Clemens and Macbeth talk about. I'm not going to dwell on this a lot because I have a demo which I use a Excel presentation to demo some of these things that Macbeth and Clemens are talking about. So first of all, I think I mentioned this before. Clemens and Macbeth as scholars, they're not exactly quantitative researchers. They're more interpretivists, and they're into narrative policy analysis. If you look at some of the stuff they've written, but they don't discount the value of more quantitative approaches. Although, if you read their whole book, it would seem like they might. But be that as it may, they do talk about some common approaches, quantitative or positivist approaches to looking at policy. And we're going to look at just a few of these. So surveys. Again, this class is not a quantitative methods class, but this is something to keep in mind if you're using surveys, for example, for your capstone or for a policy analysis. Although I'm sure that most of you aren't going to use a survey for this classroom project, but you might be using it in your capstone. So the big things to keep in mind, in my mind, for surveys are sampling techniques. That's the first hurdle you have to overcome. You can have a great survey design in the instrument itself. It could be a really good design, but if you don't sample correctly, your survey is going to be running the risk of not being valid. I mean, your sample has to look like your population. So survey writing, which I talk about here, survey writing actually applies to interview writing too. And that is that, the bottom line is you want to be clear. You want to avoid smuggling in your own bias. And you want to be able to compare the answers given by person A to the answers given by person B and person C, right? So how do you do that? Here's some tips from Macbeth and Clemens that I think are really useful. And in another class, or a couple other classes where I've had students interview people, I've actually applied these same kinds of tips, right? So avoid biasing in your question, avoid vague questions, avoid questions that produce uninformed results, and especially when you're surveying, really kind of have your statistics in mind. How are you going to measure this survey? And how are you going to rank the answers? And so surveys are really useful, but again, the big things in surveys are sampling and the instrument itself, which has to do with how you ask the questions. So the next slides provide a few more concepts from Clemens and Macbeth, and these are the ones I cover in the demo. So extrapolation and forecasting. So in the book, in Clemens and Macbeth, they talk about forecasting the population of a town. And my demo does exactly that. So combine the reading in the text with my demo, and you should actually understand where some of this extrapolation comes from and some of the ways that you can use extrapolation. But when you are extrapolating, just a couple things to be aware of, and that is, of course, the future doesn't always resemble the past because things happen, and the past does not necessarily predict the future. And also be aware of the reasons for change. So if a city is growing or a town is growing, why is it growing? Why is it shrinking? Those are the kinds of questions that this kind of extrapolation should drive you towards. Understanding historical trends and growth. That's really important. And in the demo, in the Excel demo, I talk about two ways of looking at growth. And in my example, I'm talking about budget expenditures, but you could also use it for budget revenues too. Understanding why budgets, either on the revenue side or the expenditure side, grow year to year, right? And actually getting a handle on what that growth rate looks like. And then that enables you actually to find the places where there's unexpected growth. Because in fact, many budgets in the public sector grow incrementally, but then every once in a while you'll see a punctuation, and that's what Baumgartner and Jones call it, punctuated equilibrium, where budgets grow in some kind of equilibrium or incrementally, and then all of a sudden you see a punctuation in that. Well, what caused that punctuation? It could be a massive policy change, it could be a natural disaster, but it's important to understand how budget growth occurs over time. And so I give you a couple ways of actually tracking that in the demo. In the demo, I'm going to talk about measures of central tendency, even though I'm pretty sure all of you know about measures of central tendency and what kinds of measures you should use given the kinds of variables that you have, right? So nominal variables are really just categorical variables, like male, female, like ethnic divisions, right? Like that you see in the census. Did you vote in the 2018 election? Yes or no, right? Then there's ordinal variables, really, that just rank order choices. And that is the kind of variable that you often see in surveys when people use what are called Likert scales, scales of 1 to 5, listing agreement or disagreement, or scales of 1 to 7, listing relative agreement or disagreement with a statement. And then there are interval variables, right? And that's just actual data that have a meaningful 0 point. So when I ask you, how many times did you order from Amazon in the past year? How many years have you lived in Omaha? You can actually come up with a number, and that varies across all the responses in an interval way. And then there's ratio, but this is like interval, but it's expressed as a whole. Like, so the first 20% of the population, the second 20%, the third 20%. So ratio intervals are used a lot when we start talking about things like income, right? So we always look at the median income. But we might also look at the 75th percentile income or the 90th percentile income, because it's important to actually compare those kinds of intervals and see how policy might affect those kinds of intervals. So, for example, how does the tax law affect those in the 90th percentile of median income? How does it affect those below the median? So that's where we might start using those kinds of measures. So cost-benefit analysis or benefit of cost analysis. So in my demo, I spend a lot of time on this. So the explanation uses the example in the text in my demo, but please also, on that Conservation Strategy Fund video series, they really provide some excellent supplemental instruction. So in the private sector, cost-benefit analysis mostly considers internal costs and benefits, right? So we might call that a fiscal-based cost-benefit analysis. But in the public sector, we often try to calculate other costs and benefits that affect the local economy or the larger economy, and therefore it's an economic cost-benefit analysis. And that the Conservation Strategy Fund series talks about this idea of an economic cost-benefit analysis. So the foundation of all cost-benefit analysis is this notion that all costs and benefits can be monetized. That is often difficult to do in practice. So for example, how does one monetize externalities such as air pollution? And people have done that, but it's difficult to do. That in fact is the basis of carbon trading, is the idea that we can monetize externalities. How do we monetize costs and benefits outside of our control? such as the local effect on businesses of building the new baseball stadium or the new arena, right? So again, here people attempt to do that. They say, if we build this arena, um, you know, restaurants, bars, retail will cluster around this arena, and we will therefore gain X amount of tax revenue in the form of sales taxes or property taxes. But again, the monetization of those benefits might be difficult. But how do we monetize other social costs? For example, the cost of juvenile delinquency that will be diminished if we build a community center with a pool or with basketball courts. So how will that affect, court costs? How will that affect policing costs? Again, it's possible to do that, but it does become very subjective in some ways. So here from Kraft are, this is on page 196, the cost benefit analysis steps, and Kraft has these four. First, identify all the important costs and benefits, right? That's actually doing that monetizing kind of exercise. What are they? Into step two, where you actually say, okay, here's all my benefits, here's all my costs, and here's how I monetize them over time. Then you adjust the measurements for changes in value over time. That is discounting. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then you sum up and compare all the costs and the benefits and conclude whether the costs outweigh the benefits or vice versa. And that's actually, using the two ways of looking at costs versus benefits. It's benefits minus costs, or it's benefits divided by costs. In Clemens and Macbeth, they have these 9 steps, and they're really very similar. They just actually expand a few of the steps from Kraft, and they include, the idea of coming up with a recommendation. But if you look at this, if you look at these 9 steps, you see that this is really kind of similar, to the 8-step approach that Bardach talks about in terms of policy analysis in general, isn't it? So again, cost-benefit analysis, like the Bardach text in policy analysis, is really just a way of thinking through a problem. So let's break these down. So from Clemens and Macbeth. So the specifications of objectives, right? This is asking, what is it you really want to do, and why do you want to do it, and what's your vision of success? I know that sounds like strategic planning, and it kind of is like strategic planning. But the idea is, you really actually have to spend time doing this if you're actually trying to engage in an expensive project. You really want to ask the question, what is it we want to do, and what's our vision of success? So again, the sports arena example. Why does the city want to build a sports arena? What does success look like with this sports arena? I mean, how many concerts per year does success equal? How many sporting events does success equal per year? How many restaurants and bars and retail businesses built around the arena equal success? So you're actually thinking through that. This is a thinking exercise. And then the second one is identification of alternatives. So if we have a goal in mind, are there other ways we can do this? And so I talk about, do we need a community swimming pool, or do we need a splash pad? And I talk about this in the example from the book. This is where you actually ask, is there a viable do-nothing alternative to our grand idea? There might be a viable do-nothing alternative. And who's helping you do this, right? That speaks to partnerships and collaboration. So the next step in Clemens and Macbeth is this idea of collecting, analyzing, and interpreting information. So this is actually where you're starting to collect your price list, if you will, of costs and benefits. You've thought through it. You've actually listed what these things are. Now you're actually going to go through the effort, really, of doing the math to monetize them. And in this step, in a public project, I would say this is where it's really important that you start, separating budget, costs, and benefits versus economic costs and benefits. I mean, that's really going to be important in the future, right? Um, because both those things are important in the public sector, but they have to both be understood. Especially, if you're talking about something like a collaborative project. I mean, what's it going to cost the budget of the city versus how much is being contributed by, for-profit businesses, nonprofits? You have to start understanding the separation of those things. And then we get to these two steps: the specification of target groups and stakeholders, and the specific identification of costs and benefits. And so these relate to each other. Um, so in your project, who are the target groups? Who are the stakeholders? So we think of stakeholders like citizens, but not all citizens will use the service. So who are the users of the service? And then taxpayers. So actually, this is a kind of a philosophical question. Are all citizens taxpayers? Are all taxpayers citizens? And do taxpayers and citizens at large have different interests? And then we have civic and service groups or local business groups who have interests in your project, right? You have peer departments in government. So the police department, the fire department, city planning, the parks department. What are their interests in your project? And then you might have local nonprofits. And finally, you have elected leaders. And this isn't even a complete list, but elected leaders might be local elected leaders, but they might also be people like the governor, state senators, even national office holders like your U.S. senator or the the representative from your congressional district. So what are all the desires of these stakeholders with reference to your project? And that translates into this specific identification of costs and benefits. I mean, to whom do the costs and benefits accrue? And that's really an important question to ask. And to do that, to answer that question, you have to start talking about things like direct versus indirect costs and direct versus indirect benefits. You set up a department to administer your project, and they are going to accrue costs, but are these really the direct costs of the project? And tangible versus intangible costs and benefits. So again, here's where we start talking about things like, this will really be good. It would really be great for the city if we could build this giant stadium and get an NFL team. Okay, it'll bring a lot of name recognition to the city. Okay, great. That's kind of an intangible benefit, right? Name recognition of your city is an intangible benefit. Are you going to spend the money to build this giant NFL stadium to do that? But then there's private sector costs and benefits because, in fact, for a lot of public projects, a lot of private sector businesses are going to benefit, but some are going to lose, right? And you can think of ways that businesses lose on public projects. And specifically, you can see sometimes road projects that end up cutting off businesses from the normal traffic flow. How do we account for that? And those are some of the things that have to be considered in the identification of costs and benefits. And so the last one, which people get wrapped around, is discounting. So, okay, so discounting. What do we mean by discounting? Really, it's a math procedure, and in your assignment for this week, I want you to use discounting, but I just want you to understand discounting from the standpoint of what happens when I change the discount rate. Philosophically, what discounting is actually understanding the present value of money compared to the future. So we discount in general because we assume that a given amount of money, say $1,000, today is worth more or less 1 year from now. If I give you $1,000 today, you have to ask the question, if I give you $1,000 a year from now, let's say, I say I can either give you $1,000 today or $1,000 a year from now. You're probably going to take the $1,000 today because you discount the future, because you assume that $1,000 a year from now is not going to be worth as much as $1,000 today. But the question is, how much less is it going to be? And that actually has to do with your discount rate. So what discount rate do we select, right? Um, this actually has some very practical implications. One real practical implication that discount rates has for humans as individuals is lottery tickets. So if you buy a lottery ticket in the $320 million lottery or whatever it's at, um, and you win, let's say you win the $320 million, the chances are you're going to take the lump sum. Because most people do take the lump sum, as it turns out, for those big winnings. Well, in fact, if you live long enough, you would be better off taking the annual annuity because of the way that is structured. The net present value of the money for the annuity is a lot higher than the net present value of the lump sum payment. But most people discount the future, and so they're going to take the lump sum. But another real practical way that discount rates are important in public policy is public sector pensions. And so, in essence, if a public entity, say a school district or a state pension fund or some pension fund, says that our discount rate is 8% or our discount rate is 6% or our discount rate is 10%, that affects actually the amount of money that has to be contributed to the fund and what you state as the pension liability. So a higher discount rate gives you a lower current pension liability. A lower discount rate gives you a higher current pension liability, meaning that the entity itself and the employees, if it's contributory, have to contribute more into the fund. So there's really no hard and fast rule on what discount rates you use, although some people recommend you use the risk-free rate, which is roughly equivalent to the 3-month Treasury bill, which right now is about 2.4%. I give you an article by Monell et al. Where they talk about a 5% risk-free rate. So I give you a couple articles in the supplemental reading that talk about the impact of discount rates on public sector pensions. But in reality, for this exercise, we're not really going into the philosophy of discount rates so much, except to say that we use them in our cost-benefit analysis. So the final two steps are kind of evaluative criteria on their own that Clemens and Macbeth tie to cost-benefit analysis, but estimation of risk and uncertainty. So remember, we already talked about risk and uncertainty, and specifications for selection of your alternatives. So what they're doing here, what they're saying is you shouldn't just quit at a cost-benefit analysis. Once you have your answer from the cost-benefit analysis, you should apply a little bit more analysis, and they're talking about a risk analysis, and then they're talking about how we select alternatives, right? And here they say they actually refer back to some of the steps or some of the other evaluative criteria that Kraft is talking about. And so I guess the bottom line on that is that evaluative criteria can work together, and it's important to understand that you might use cost-benefit analysis, but then you actually have to understand, okay, so what's the political support that we have for trying to get this done? And that kind of goes back to our earlier discussions about evidence-based policymaking, right? You could come in with all the scientific evidence to a group of policymakers to talk about here's what we should do about carbon that's produced by plants, manufacturing plants, but they might have a different calculation, a more political calculation they use to evaluate that evidence. So all that's to say that evaluative criteria can actually work together and sometimes oppose each other. So that gets me to the exercise for the week. So actually, you're going to have to go to the exercise write-up. But basically, what I want you to do is complete a cost-benefit analysis, and I give you a scenario. It's I give you a document with a scenario, and basically what you're going to do is compare two homeless shelter options that this mythical city has, um, using the cost-benefit analysis kind of techniques that I talk about in the discussion and in my demo. I give you a cost-benefit analysis template spreadsheet, and I give you a description of the cost-benefit analysis that I want you to do. So basically, you're going to do the spreadsheets and you're going to attach them to your discussion. And yes, I promise that compared to 2 weeks ago, I actually fixed the defaults in Canvas, and you can attach now. So attach your spreadsheet that compares your two options, and then talk about cost-benefit analysis in general, and also about this specific cost-benefit analysis. So thanks a lot. I look forward to your inputs.